You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
Around 5:15 p.m. on Sunday, May 22nd, 2011, 16-year-old Stephen Weersing was riding in the passenger seat of his friend Johnny's car as they barreled through the streets of Joplin, Missouri. It was a perfect spring day. They had the windows rolled down, and their friend Dylan, who was in the back seat, was singing along to the Blink-182 song that was blasting from the radio. And as they drove, Stephen stuck his right arm out the window to feel the wind, and as he did, he admired the tattoo that ran the length of his right forearm. The tattoo spelled Stephen's last name in a style that sort of looked like graffiti. He'd gotten it 2 weeks ago, and although he loved it, his parents did not, and they were still upset that he had actually gotten it. But Stephen didn't really care. Stephen turned around and asked Dylan to pass up the bag of potato chips they'd just bought at the store. Dylan took one more handful and then thrust the bag forward, and as Stephen grabbed the bag, big raindrops began hitting the windshield. Johnny quickly rolled up the windows, and when Stephen looked outside, he noticed the sky had gone from, slightly overcast to now very dark gray. Stephen instinctively turned down the volume on the radio and then said to his friends that it looked like a serious storm was coming. Johnny nodded and said he would start driving back to his house in South Joplin, where they could all wait out the storm together. But just 5 minutes later, as Johnny weaved through the back roads of the small city, the drizzling rain became a full-on downpour, and strong winds began to shake the car. Stephen leaned close to the windshield, trying to see through the heavy rain smashing into it to try to help his friend find the correct turn. But then something bounced off the window right in front of Stephen's face, startling him and causing everybody in the car to gasp. Stephen quickly realized that they were all kind of overreacting. It was just a stick that had hit the windshield, and for a second, Stephen wanted to laugh. But then all three boys heard off in the distance the ominous sound of a tornado siren, loud and clear even through the pounding rain. Growing up in a part of the country that's sometimes called Tornado Alley, Stephen and his friends had been through their fair share of tornadoes, and so they'd heard these sirens before. Normally, storms didn't really scare Stephen, but he could already tell that this storm, this tornado, was different. It had come on with almost no warning, and now more sticks and rocks were beating the sides of the car, and the gray sky had taken on a sickly orange tint. Johnny, who was white-knuckling the steering wheel at this point, turned to Stephen and Dylan and said, "Hey, we're almost at my house. I'm going to try to outrun the storm." And then Johnny hit the gas, turned right, and the rain actually suddenly stopped. For a moment, all Stephen and his friends could hear was just the urgent wail of the tornado siren. But then this overwhelmingly loud rumbling noise like a jet engine made Stephen suddenly cover his ears. And then pieces of cement and plywood began crashing into the car, this time shattering the passenger side window and filling the car with broken glass. Stephen turned to his friends, absolutely terrified, and he could see from all their looks that they were scared too. And then Stephen realized that the reason the rain had just stopped for a second is because Johnny had just unknowingly driven directly into the path of the tornado. But now there was basically nothing they could do. Johnny continued to try to drive, but the car began to shake harder and harder, and then Stephen felt the entire vehicle literally rise off the ground until none of the wheels were touching the road. Stephen and the others did their best to try to shield their bodies from all the debris flying through the broken window, but as the car began to spin faster and faster in midair, Stephen felt the wind pulling him out of the car. He screamed, and his friends grabbed his legs, frantically trying to keep him inside. And then, as suddenly as the car had risen off the ground, it came smashing back down onto the street, landing on its roof and throwing the three teenagers out onto the street. But the tornado was not finished with them yet. Stephen's friends gripped the car to brace themselves against the strong winds, but Stephen had fallen further away from the vehicle, and he was again swept back up into the swirling vortex, this time with no car around him to protect him. Stephen watched as his friends grew smaller and smaller as Stephen was sucked farther up into the air. For just a moment, Stephen was acutely aware of the roaring wind and the debris pummeling him from all sides, and then everything went black. On the other side of town, Stephen's father, David, listened to the weather report on TV while he made sure all of his windows were shut and locked. The meteorologist said that a giant, mile-wide tornado was wreaking havoc on the southern part of Joplin, with winds blowing over 200 miles per hour. But even people who lived further north, like David, should still take cover. Just then, David's landline phone rang, and when he picked it up, he heard his ex-wife, Carissa, speaking, and she sounded very concerned. She asked David if he had heard from either of their sons. Ever since David and Carissa had gotten divorced, the couple shared custody of their kids, and both boys were staying at David's house that weekend. Carissa said she'd been trying to get in touch with the boys to warn them about the tornado, but she couldn't get in touch with them. Neither of them were answering their phones. David told Carissa that he had spoken to their younger son, Nathan, and he was safe, but he hadn't heard from Stephen all weekend, which was actually normal, because at the time, Stephen was going through a rebellious phase. Stephen and his dad had gotten into a big argument after Stephen decided to drop out of high school, and lately, Stephen would leave home for days at a time without telling anyone where he was, and he would do the exact same thing when he was staying at his mother's house. But David knew, despite all that, Stephen had a good heart, and he wouldn't just ignore his parents' phone calls when they just wanted to know that he was safe. So David told Carissa he would try to get in touch with Stephen. So David hung up and then used his cell phone to call and text Stephen. He didn't get a response, and as the rain and wind picked up outside and the tornado sirens continued to blare, David started to worry. He told himself that, Stephen was probably at one of his friends' houses, but Stephen had buddies all over the city. What if he'd been visiting someone in South Joplin, in the tornado's path? But there really wasn't anything David could do. With the storm outside, David basically just had to stay home and wait it out before he went out looking for his son. 30 minutes later, David was glued to the news, and the meteorologist finally reported that the tornado in South Joplin had passed and it was now safe for people to go outside. David still had not been able to contact Stephen, so as soon as he heard the all clear, he grabbed his keys and ran out to his car. David planned to drive to the two hospitals in Joplin to check if Stephen was at either one. And as he drove, David felt a bit of relief seeing that his neighborhood was still in good shape. There was debris here and there, and a few thin trees had snapped in half, but nobody's houses or cars were severely damaged. However, David's relief turned to anxiety as he drove further south, where the tornado had actually touched down, and he saw the widespread devastation. To David, it looked like a giant had stomped right on top of the town. Houses were flattened into piles of wood and brick, power lines had collapsed, battered cars and trucks were littered all over the streets, creating roadblocks that were nearly impossible to pass. David turned on the car radio to see what the local news station was saying about the storm, and a reporter came on and said the tornado had been categorized as an EF5, which is the highest on the scale. Thousands of buildings had been damaged or destroyed, hundreds of residents were injured, and dozens of people had already been found dead. David fought hard to keep his anxiety at bay, praying that Stephen had not been in this area when the tornado had come through. Finally, David reached St. John's Regional Medical Center, and he was horrified to see that the huge multi-story building had been decimated too. An entire side of the hospital was now gone, and David could see first responders running in and out of the building, hustling survivors out. And so David just turned and began driving toward Joplin's other hospital called Freeman Health System. As he pulled into the parking lot, David was relieved to see that Freeman was still standing. And so he parked his car in the lot and then ran inside. Entering Freeman Hospital was like walking into a nightmare. The emergency room was crowded with people who'd been injured, some quite badly. David saw one man who had a bloody, obviously broken leg, and there was a woman with shards of glass literally sticking out of her arms and chest. He could hear children crying and the muted sounds of an ambulance pulling up outside. And at least a dozen people were lined up in front of the reception desk, all new patients waiting to be checked in. David didn't want to waste valuable time waiting in that line, so he just started walking around the lobby asking random hospital employees if they'd seen a skinny 16-year-old boy with dark shaggy hair. But everyone he talked to said no. But just then, a doctor came out of the doors that led to the emergency room, and her blue scrubs were stained with blood, and she looked completely overwhelmed. But David just sprinted right up to her and asked her the same question. Hey, have you seen my son? He's 16, he's got scraggly hair, he's skinny, and he also has a big tattoo on his right forearm. When the doctor heard this, in particular the right forearm tattoo comment, the doctor's expression changed, and she told David to please follow her. And she led him through the chaotic hallway and into a room where a teenage boy was lying unconscious on a bed with a breathing tube inserted directly into the front of his neck. His face was so badly injured that David didn't actually recognize him. But then the doctor walked over to the boy and gently lifted up the boy's right arm and showed David the tattoo. And when David saw it, he knew immediately he'd found his son. The doctor said a good Samaritan had brought Stephen and one of his friends to the hospital, and Stephen apparently had been riding around with 2 other teenage boys when their car had been sucked up into the tornado. The other 2 teenagers were okay, but Stephen was not. He was in terrible shape. He had a serious head injury, several cracked ribs, a punctured lung, and a deep, open wound on his abdomen that left the right side of his rib cage totally exposed. But despite all his injuries, the doctor said that hospital staff had been able to stabilize him. And so right now, the doctor said he was doing basically as well as he could be, and they hoped he would just continue to improve. David was shocked and horrified and heartbroken to hear what his son had gone through, but the doctor at least sounded somewhat optimistic, which made David hopeful too. And so David thanked the doctor and then called Stephen's mother, Carissa, to tell her the bad news. 5 days later, Carissa sat beside her son's hospital bed, wishing that Stephen could talk to her. The doctors were keeping him in a medically induced coma so that his brain could heal from his traumatic head injury. But Carissa spoke to him anyway, telling him that she loved him and that he was strong. And she wanted to believe that her son could hear her because he did seem to be doing better. Some of Stephen's bruises were lightening up, and the smaller scrapes and cuts he had were starting to heal as well. But one side of his face was still covered in a thick scab, and Carissa had not yet dared to look beneath the huge white bandage that stretched from her son's belly button up to his right armpit. Carissa reached out to hold Stephen's hand, and she noticed that his fingers looked bigger than usual, like they were swollen. Carissa got up and walked to the other side of his bed, and she saw that his other hand looked swollen too. A few minutes later, when a nurse came in to check on Stephen, Carissa asked about Stephen's hands. The nurse looked closely and said the swelling in his hands might be caused by an infection inside of his body. The nurse did not seem that concerned, but she told Carissa she would ask the doctor to get Stephen started on a course of antibiotics right away, which should help his body fight off this infection. Carissa nodded and gave the nurse a weak smile like she was okay with this answer, but inside, she had no idea what kind of infection caused a person's hands to swell up so much. But the nurse did not seem like she had any time for questions. She was already rushing out of the room. Carissa knew the doctors and nurses were doing their best, but they were clearly overworked, and it worried her that they hadn't noticed these signs of Stephen's potential infection. But Carissa just felt glad that she was at least there to look after her son and make sure his medical team didn't miss anything. And so she and David agreed to coordinate their schedules so that at least one of them was always by Stephen's side. On June 1st, so 3 days after Stephen's antibiotic treatment began, Carissa and David were sitting beside each other on the small couch in Stephen's room when a doctor walked in. He had a grave expression on his face as he told the parents that the antibiotics did not seem to be working. In fact, the swelling in Stephen's hands had only gotten worse. And now he was also running a fever, and his blood pressure kept jumping and then plummeting. The doctor said that with every passing hour, Stephen's condition was getting less and less stable. And the doctor admitted that the hospital didn't have the resources to take care of Stephen at the moment. They were struggling just to find beds for all the patients who'd been injured during the tornado. The doctor said that what Stephen really needed was a team of doctors who had the time and space to care for him properly. So they suggested having Stephen airlifted 150 miles north to Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. The doctor promised Stephen would get better, more specialized care there than he could in Joplin. For the parents, this was not even a question. Of course they would take Stephen wherever he needed to go to get better. So just a few minutes later, Carissa watched as medical staff loaded her still unconscious son into a medical helicopter, and then David jumped in after him and gave Carissa a hesitant wave goodbye. Carissa backed away and watched as the helicopter took off and began its journey, and then Carissa headed out to the parking lot, got into her car, and began the long drive north to Kansas City. That same afternoon, at the Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, a pediatric infectious disease specialist named Dr. Marianne Jackson stepped into the room where her newest patient had just arrived. Dr. Jackson, who was a very energetic woman, had decades of experience treating children with unidentified infections, which made her the perfect person to take care of Stephen. She'd already been briefed on his condition, so when she went into his room, she was not surprised to see him laying there unconscious with a breathing tube down his throat. Dr. Jackson introduced herself to Stephen's father, who was in the room, and she explained that she was here to figure out what was causing his son's hands to swell up. And then Dr. Jackson walked over to Stephen and looked at his hands, which were definitely still very swollen, but she couldn't see any open wounds on his hands or wrists where an infection could develop. And so Dr. Jackson began to check out the rest of Stephen's injuries. The scabs on his face were healing well, and so too were the cuts and bruises on his arms and legs. That just left Stephen's biggest wound, the one on his abdomen, which was currently covered by a huge white bandage. Dr. Jackson carefully removed that bandage, and even though the doctors from Freeman Health System had warned her about the severity of Stephen's injury, she still was not prepared for what she saw. His entire side was exposed. The skin, fat, and muscle that would normally protect his ribcage had all been ripped away. And then Dr. Jackson noticed that sort of surrounding this horrible wound on his abdomen was this weird, shiny black material that almost looked like patent leather. Dr. Jackson recognized this as dead tissue. Whatever infection Stephen had, it was causing the skin and muscle around the wound to die and turn black. Dr. Jackson knew that this was obviously a very dangerous situation. Dead tissue can be a breeding ground for all kinds of dangerous bacteria, plus it stops wounds from healing properly. Dr. Jackson explained to Stephen's father they would need to bring his son in for surgery immediately. All of that dead black tissue around Stephen's wound would need to be surgically removed as soon as possible. David looked uneasy, but he said, okay, whatever you have to do. And then he squeezed his son's hand and told him that he was strong and he was going to be okay. And then a nurse came in and wheeled Stephen away to be prepped for surgery. That evening, in the operating room, Dr. Jackson watched as a surgeon carefully removed sections of the thick black tissue from around Stephen's chest wound. The surgeon cut away as much dead tissue as he could find, but what was left behind didn't look very healthy either. Dr. Jackson could already tell that Stephen was almost certainly going to need another operation after this one. And so after the surgeon was done and began putting a fresh bandage over Stephen's chest, Dr. Jackson took samples of the dead tissue they'd removed and sent them to the hospital lab for analysis. 2 days later, Dr. Jackson was back in the operating room, standing next to the surgeon as he held a scalpel close to Stephen's chest. They had not received the results of tissue analysis from the lab yet, but when Dr. Jackson checked in on Stephen that morning, she realized she had been right. He definitely needed more surgery. Because not only was there more dying and blackened tissue surrounding Stephen's wound, but something even more disturbing was happening. Something that Dr. Jackson had never seen in over 25 years of practicing medicine. Looking down at Stephen's exposed ribs, Dr. Jackson and the surgeon both saw fuzzy black material growing on top of Stephen's bones and into his muscles. Dr. Jackson turned to the surgeon and said it sort of looked like mold. And so whatever infection Stephen had, it was clearly eating away at his flesh and also spreading throughout his chest cavity. And even though Stephen was on huge doses of antibiotics, this infection kept on growing at an alarming rate. Dr. Jackson watched as the surgeon carved away as much of the mold and dead tissue as he could. But still, Dr. Jackson knew this was not sustainable. With each surgery, they were chopping off more and more of Stephen's skin and muscle. And so they couldn't just keep doing that because that would eventually kill him. Plus, this infection appeared to just grow back anyway. But regardless, when the surgeon was finished and Stephen went back to the recovery room, Dr. Jackson briefed his parents about what she and the surgeon had found. She still didn't know what this infection was, but it was clearly very aggressive and was not responding to any of the medications the doctors had tried so far. Dr. Jackson swore she was going to do everything she possibly could to help their son, but she admitted it was going to take a miracle for their son to pull through this. David looked at the doctor with tears in his eyes. He said he didn't understand how this was happening. One moment, Stephen was a perfectly healthy kid. The next, he was injured in this freak tornado accident. And now his body was being ravaged by some kind of mysterious flesh-eating infection. And nobody could tell them what it was, how he got it, or how to help him. It just didn't make any sense. 10 days later, Dr. Jackson arrived for her shift at the hospital. She pulled on her white coat and walked down the hallway towards Stephen's room to check on him. But she was not feeling optimistic. Ever since Stephen's second surgery, his condition had just kept on getting worse. The tissue surrounding his wound was slowly dying, and as hard as the hospital staff had tried to keep his wounds clean, that fuzzy black mold just kept coming back. But just before she got to Stephen's room, a lab technician stopped her in the hallway and told her they'd finally gotten the results of Stephen's tissue analysis. This lab report did explain what was causing Stephen's life-threatening infection. And while Dr. Jackson was glad to finally have some answers, she knew that this diagnosis was not good news. The rare infection that was ravaging Stephen's body had less than a 20% survival rate, and the only treatment was absolutely brutal. Surgeons would need to cut every last bit of the infection out of his body. And so just a few hours later, Dr. Jackson was once again in the operating room with the same surgeon who had performed Stephen's first two surgeries. And as the surgeon sliced away mold and dead tissue, he suddenly turned to Dr. Jackson with a horrified expression on his face. Now, the mold was not just on Stephen's bones and in his muscles. Mold had also made its way into Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. In order to get this infection out of Stephen's body, the surgeon was going to have to remove parts of Stephen's vital organs. Dr. Jackson told the surgeon that they just didn't have any other choice. Stephen might die if he lost parts of these organs, but he would definitely die if the surgeon left any trace of the infection behind. So, the surgeon very carefully began to cut away moldy sections of Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. And when the surgery was over, Stephen had lost so much bodily tissue that Dr. Jackson could literally see his internal organs through the gaps in his ribs. She could see his lungs inflate and could see what was left of his heart still beating. And so even though Dr. Jackson wanted to remain optimistic, looking down at the mangled boy, she just couldn't imagine how he was going to survive this. 8 weeks later, in August of 2011, Stephen's mom, Carissa, was curled up on the fold-out bed in Stephen's hospital room, trying her best to relax. She had stayed there almost every night that summer, but she rarely got any sleep. Even after the doctors had removed parts of Stephen's vital organs, the infection kept coming back. And so Stephen had undergone 12 more surgeries to remove mold and dead tissue from inside of his chest. And then, a few days after Stephen's most recent surgery, Dr. Jackson had roused Carissa to tell her that for the first time, the mold had not come back. They had finally cured Stephen's infection. At first, Carissa wanted to celebrate, but then reality came crashing down on her. As doctors worked hard to save Stephen's life, his body had been damaged almost beyond repair. Despite this infection being gone, he might never wake up from his coma. And even if he did, at a minimum, he was going to need multiple reconstructive surgeries and years of physical therapy. And so that evening, thoughts about her son's uncertain future kept Carissa wide awake as usual. And so, needing a distraction, Carissa sat up, grabbed the TV remote, and flipped through the channels until she found MTV, Stephen's favorite channel. And then she sat upright on the hard fold-out bed and reached over to hold her son's hand. Out of the corner of her eye, she could have sworn she saw Stephen move. Carissa turned her head and looked at Stephen, and she saw that she was not mistaken. Stephen was blinking. His eyes were now wide open. For the first time since the tornado nearly 3 months ago, her son was awake. Stephen looked around the room, confused about where he was and what was happening, and then a moment later, he looked right at his mom, and she burst out laughing and crying at the same time, totally overcome with joy. The following morning, Dr. Jackson stood next to Stephen's hospital bed. Stephen's parents were both in the room, and they both looked happier and more energized than they had in months. Although Dr. Jackson had been treating Stephen since June, this was the first time she was really meeting him, and the shaggy-haired teenager had a lot of questions for her. He said that the last thing that he could remember was tumbling out of his friend's car and being pulled up into the tornado. He had no idea what happened after that. Dr. Jackson told him that the fact that he was alive was a miracle. She explained how terribly injured he'd been after the tornado, but that wasn't even the worst of it. After being hurt, he developed this infection that ate away at his skin, muscles, and organs, and very nearly killed him. This incredibly rare infection was called zygomycosis, and it was caused by a fungus that had invaded Stephen's body. The fungus blocked off his blood vessels, causing his skin and muscle tissue to die and rot. At the same time, it grew rapidly inside of his body, appearing as black mold on his ribs and in his muscles and organs. This fungus usually lives in water or underground, and it doesn't normally make people sick. However, during the devastating tornado, which killed over 150 people and injured thousands of others, this fungus had been swept up into the vortex. And after Stephen's chest was cut wide open, that fungus that was in the tornado was literally blown into his chest cavity, where it took hold and began multiplying quickly. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention determined that 12 other people who were affected by this tornado had also developed the same horrible infection as Stephen because they had open wounds and the fungus was blown inside of them. But Dr. Jackson actually told Stephen that compared to some of the other victims, he was one of the lucky ones. 5 of those 12 other people affected by this fungus had died. Stephen had to spend another 3 months in the hospital before he was healthy enough to go home. Even then, he underwent multiple reconstructive surgeries and was left with a giant scar stretching from his belly button almost to his neck. But much like the tattoo he got when he was 16, Stephen feels like his huge tornado scar is an important part of his story because it shows how far he's come. After his battle with deadly fungal infection, Stephen decided to go back to school and finish his education. And today, he's a proud father to 4 young kids, and he couldn't be happier. Although, from time to time, he still has nightmares about the tornado that changed his life.
In 1918, during World War I, British soldier Henry Tandy found himself stationed inside of a trench in northern France. By this point, Henry was already considered a war hero, and he would go on to become the most decorated British soldier in World War I. But his awards are not what he is remembered for. On September 28th of that year, after a long day of fighting, Henry was propped up on the edge of his trench looking out towards the German line. It was dark and quiet, and there was mist in the air, and at some point, Henry noticed a figure way off in the distance walking towards him. Henry instinctively raised his rifle, but he didn't pull the trigger. He wanted to make sure who he was shooting was his enemy, because it could be one of their own men who got wounded and was making his way back to the trench. And so Henry's looking down his gun, staring at the sky, waiting to figure out who he is, and after a few seconds, out of the mist walks a badly wounded German soldier, so it is his enemy, but he wasn't carrying a weapon, and he didn't appear to understand he was walking directly into Henry's sights. Henry aimed his rifle right at this German man's heart, but he didn't pull the trigger, and the man just continued to walk directly towards Henry until he got about 30 meters away, at which point he stopped and looked up and realized his mistake. But instead of trying to run away, he just stood there and stared at Henry, seeming to accept the fact that he was about to die. Now, Henry had shot many men during the war so far, but he just could not bring himself to shoot this unarmed, wounded German who just looked kind of pathetic. And so with Henry's gun still up, he glanced to his left and he glanced to his right to make sure nobody was watching, none of his comrades were going to see this, and then he lowered his gun. And then Henry and this German man just stared at each other for a while until the German man just nodded his thanks, turned around, and wandered back into the mist out of sight. The man Henry had just saved was Adolf Hitler. In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong, and he said, "You know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal. Just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave." And so Deborah said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream." And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed and she's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, "Honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now." And her husband did not want to go. And he said, "Come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal." But she was adamant. She said, "Get out of bed. We're leaving right now." And so begrudgingly, her husband said, "Okay, we'll leave right now." And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence, and then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal, and at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it, and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it, and she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, "Honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road." And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, "Hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her." But Deborah at this point is now terrified and she's saying, "No, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there and they're going to lure us in and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her." And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car and they'll be out in a couple of minutes and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up, and they tell them to drive back up the road, but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road, the police came up on their side, and they said, "Yep, right around the corner, you're gonna find her lying on the ground on the left side." And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn, and they kind of disappear out of sight, and then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn, and so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road, and they stopped next to Deborah's car, and they said, "You know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body, there wasn't anything out of the ordinary." And Deborah would say to police, "I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it. It's right over there." And they would tell her that, "We believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there." And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over, he's intrigued, and he asks them, "What happened? What did you see?" And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend, and when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds, he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the train kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red 4-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain, following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water, and doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her, and then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner, that would have been impossible, because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bully and Bend and found Nicky alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she'd had this totally weird middle of the night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt before and didn't really know how to explain. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nicky had a guardian angel. In early 1983, residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London began complaining about their drains being clogged up. Initially, their landlord was dismissive and said, "Oh, it's just an old building, it's old plumbing, and that's why it's slow." But eventually, the landlord conceded and asked a plumber to come out and have a look. And so, on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Mike came out to Cranley Gardens, and after learning what the complaints were, he went around to the side of the building and he opened up a drain cover to have a look inside. As expected, when he shined his light down, he saw wads of hair and napkins and other things kind of mashed together, clogging up the pipes. And so he reached in and he began pulling the stuff out and putting it in a bucket right next to him. And then after he had cleared the majority of the obstruction, he reached his arm all the way into this pipe to feel around to see if there was anything in there that he just couldn't see. And at some point, as he was reaching, when his arm was almost completely into this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. And so he moved his fingers around to try to feel what it was, but he couldn't tell. It was something that was fairly soft, but there were some hard things inside of it, like sticks or rods. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand, and what he was holding looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any meat he had ever seen before. And inside of this fleshy substance looked like little bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared many pipes before, and he had never seen meat be the reason for a blockage. And so this whole situation just seemed really strange, and he decided, it's late, I'll just come back tomorrow with my supervisor so he can see what this is too. So Mike puts the cap back on the drain pipe, and he walks out from behind the building back out towards his truck parked on the road. And as he's walking, two of the residents of this complex come out and they say, "Hey, did you fix the blockage? What was it?" And Mike would say no, he hadn't. And then he just kind of blurted out that there was meat in the pipes. That was what was causing the blockage. And then one of these two residents says, "Well, I bet people are just flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the drains. That's what's causing it." And Mike looked at him and he was like, "Yeah, maybe." And then he just turned around, got in his truck, and he drove away. Early the next morning, Mike and his supervisor came back to Cranley Gardens, and they went around to the side of the building. They undid that cap, and then Mike reached down inside expecting to feel this blockage, but where it should have been, there was nothing. Somebody had cleared the pipes. And so Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, "There's no way that cleared on its own. Someone had to have come out here and cleared it, but I don't know why they would have done that and still had us come out." But the men decide, maybe by chance it did just kind of slip through and cleared itself, so let's just continue the process and make sure each of the apartment buildings, their individual pipe is unobstructed. And when they checked these pipes, they found all of them were clear except for one, apartment number 23, whose pipe was blocked up with more of this meaty substance. Mike and his partner were already very suspicious of the fact that someone had snuck out here in the middle of the night and cleared the pipe. Probably. They didn't know if that happened, but it seemed likely. And now they're finding more of this weird meat substance coming from a particular apartment. And so the whole situation just seemed off. And so they told the landlord that they were not going to touch this. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. And the landlord, after finding out there was meat jammed in the pipes, got really freaked out and called the police. The police showed up, they pulled this meat substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary where a pathologist looked at it and said, "This is meat. It's human meat." And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of apartment number 23's pipes is that of a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens, they go up to apartment number 23, they knock on the door, and when the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of just rotting flesh. And standing in the doorway of this apartment, the owner of the apartment, is this guy who's in his late 30s, early 40s, who introduces himself as Dennis Nielsen. And they say, "Hey, Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment?" And he says, "Why?" And they say, "Well, we found human remains in your pipes." And Dennis immediately says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible." But the police are not buying it, and they say, "You know what, Dennis? Tell us where the rest of the body is." And at this, Dennis suddenly went expressionless, emotionless, and he just turns around and he points into his bedroom and he says, "It's in 2 plastic bags in my closet." And so before the police go into his apartment to go inspect these bags, they say, "Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about?" And Dennis sighs and he looks up to the ceiling and says, "Yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here. It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell it to you, get this off my chest, and I'll do it at the police station." So after Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his horrible story. It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and attempted to buy an alcoholic drink, and he was denied service. And so Dennis pulled him aside and said, "Hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's right down the road." And the young man, whose name was Steven, was very excited about this and said, "Great, let's go." Once they arrived back and they were up in Dennis's apartment, the pair had lots of drinks and they were having fun and laughing. And then at some point, the pair climbed into bed together. The next morning, when Dennis got up, his new friend, Steven, was still sleeping right next to him. And he had this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread because he knew as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as a one-night stand and he would just leave. He would not stick around and remain friends with Dennis. And Dennis just did not like that idea. He wanted Steven to stay. And so he looked on the ground next to the bed and he saw the necktie that Steven had been wearing was on the ground. And so he got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, he fashioned it into a noose, and then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Steven's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck, and then he pulled it as tight as he could. And as soon as it was tight, Dennis would tell police that Steven came alive, and he began reaching for his neck and kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but he just can't get it off. And at some point, Dennis said Steven just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis and knew he wasn't going to get this off and that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Steven just allowed himself to go limp, and then he slouched over. And as soon as that happened, Dennis said he relaxed. But as he's looking at Steven, he realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. And so Dennis goes into the kitchen and he gets this huge plastic bucket and he fills it up with water and he sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. And then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like a table right in front of this bucket of water. And then he drags Steven's body into the kitchen and he lays him on his back on these chairs, but makes sure his head is not resting on the chair. His head is kind of dangling off the back of these chairs. And then he grabbed that bucket of water and he slid it right underneath Steven's head. And then Dennis got on top of the chairs, on top of Steven, and then he pressed the young man's face straight down so his head went backwards until his mouth and his nose were under the water. And Dennis held him like that until Steven regained consciousness, but again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed. And after several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface and Steven was dead. Dennis pulled his victim off of the chairs, he brought him into the living room and he sat him on a chair. And then Dennis went into the kitchen and he made himself a cup of coffee and he smoked some cigarettes. And then he just stood in the doorway and looked at Steven's body. And he would tell police it was a very bizarre experience because Steven still looked like he was alive. In fact, Dennis would try talking to him as if he was going to talk back, but obviously he didn't. And at some point, Dennis realized, the life he had before he killed Steven was now over. He had a new life and he didn't really know how to handle it. And so the first thing he thought to do was to clean Steven. So he took Stephen's body and he brought him into the bathroom and he gave him a very long bath, cleaned his body, cleaned his hair, and then afterwards he got him out, he dressed him and put him into his bed, and then Dennis climbed into bed with him and laid with him. And he would tell police as he laid there, he suddenly felt overjoyed. Stephen was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with him for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Stephen's body in his apartment so no one could find him. And so he left his apartment and he went to a hardware store where he got an electric knife and a big storage bin. And he brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to cut Stephen up, he just couldn't go through with it. So instead, he just climbed into bed and took a nap next to Stephen's body. When he got up again, he moved Stephen's body onto the ground in his living room and covered him with a blanket. And then he went and made dinner and then sat in his chair in the living room right next to this body on the ground and watched TV for a while. When he was done watching TV and eating, he looked at the body on the floor and realized, he really hadn't made any progress in terms of hiding him somewhere in his apartment. And that's when he remembered he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. And so he went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up, and he saw there was a space under the floors. And so he pulled a couple more boards up, and then he grabbed Stephen's body and he attempted to force him down into this space. But by now, Stephen's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched like a Y over his head. And so as Dennis is trying to force him down in there, his arms were not allowing him to go down into that small space. So Dennis took Stephen's body and he propped him up against the wall in his bedroom. So the body is against the wall, rigid, standing up with its arms up over its head, and Stephen's eyes were still open. And then after that, Dennis just got in bed and fell asleep. So all night, this corpse is staring at Dennis in his bed. And then the next morning when Dennis got up, there was Stephen still up against the wall with his hands in the air looking down at him. Dennis grabbed Stephen's body and put it on the ground, and he began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Stephen's arms until they were pinned down by his side. And then after that, Dennis started working on his legs and his hips, and he began contorting him until he was small enough that he could pack him down under his floor. And then once he was under there, he just put the boards on top and went about his daily life. And for the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Stephen. But a week after putting him under the floor, Dennis decided he missed Stephen and he wanted to see him again. And so one night he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Stephen, and Dennis would say it looked like he was dirty. So he pulled him out of the floor and he gave him another bath. And then after he had cleaned Stephen, he pulled him out of the water, he dried him off, and he put him in the chair. And then Dennis took a bath himself in the same water he had just used to clean Stephen. After a long soak in this tub, Dennis finally got out, he toweled himself off, he redressed Stephen, and then he forced him back onto the floorboards and covered him up again. And he would remain there for the next 7 months until Dennis finally decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of their apartment building. And then after the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking, I can't believe I just got away with murder. And so he would do it again and again and again, killing at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation or by drowning or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time, in his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors, all over his apartment. He had these bodies. And while these bodies were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. He would tell police he found corpses to be beautiful. He was fascinated by them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up and trying to force them down his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes. And so when Mike the plumber showed up and discovered this meaty substance in the pipes, and Dennis overheard him talking about it, that night after Mike was gone, Dennis had gone outside and attempted to clear the rest of the remains from the pipes. But he wasn't aware there were still remains stuck in the pipe that led to his specific apartment. Dennis Nielsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis never showed any remorse, nor did he show any desire to want to be free again. He actually said he deserved to be in jail for what he did. In 2018, Dennis Nielsen would die in prison at the age of 72.